Okay. So welcome everybody. Welcome Libby. Libby is actually an award-winning journalist and an author. She is in New York, is that correct? And you generally write about culture and science and probably how those two come together.
Yeah, that's right.
So I saw in your bio that you have actually been featured in the Washington Post, New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Smithsonian Magazine. So, I mean, not little guys. I just finished reading The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And I was really struck by just the depth of research that you did. And every time I was thinking, oh, I wonder if she's going to touch on this implication of it, it was 2 chapters down. And it was really cool because I did have so many things rolling around in my head. I've heard horror stories and really great things. And I thought you really did such a good job of talking about all the applications, all the implications, good and bad. And I can't wait to talk to you about all of it. So this book, I'm just going to read exactly what it says here. It explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. And the Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. And the Washington Post says, the Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? It was recently named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020, and I can see why.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was so nice.
So I guess my first question is, what even started you on this particular subject that developed into the book?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a journalist for over 2 decades. I spent the first half of my career at the Washington Post, and then I went freelance. And I was writing about science and culture, like the way that our discoveries, like about the mind, shape how we think about how we think, right? Um, Science of meditation and mindfulness. Questions about psychology and identity, all that stuff has been really interesting to me. And also like technology, how emerging technologies kind of shape us. So all that stuff has been really interesting to me for a long time. About 4 years ago, I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post, and we were talking about home DNA testing, which at the time, like I kind of had heard of it, but I hadn't done it. And it wasn't quite as mainstream as it is now, but we were starting to hear stories that were kind of bubbling up about people who took a home DNA test kit through like Ancestry 23andMe. They spit into a vial because they were just kind of idly curious, or they were doing their genealogy. And then they got like the answer to a question they didn't even know they were posing. Like they were kind of trying to figure out how, if they had colonial roots and how far back they went, right? And then they find out that, the ethnicity estimate's all wrong, and they start unraveling threads, and they actually find out that their dad's not genetically related to them, right? We were starting to hear stories about that. I mean, of course, even further back than that. But that was when it was, I would say, kind of reaching enough of consciousness in the media that my editor and I were talking about it. And we decided to have me do a story about it. And so I did this story. It ran on A1 of the Washington Post. And it went viral. It got reprinted like even in Ireland and like Chicago and all these different places. And I started getting feedback. I started getting emails from like people who had taken DNA tests and wanted to tell me about their experiences, right? So this was like just a wide diversity of people, but what united them was that they had just all discovered something that they would never have otherwise known, except but for DNA. And it was often very, very surprising. It was often something they didn't set out to know, but they were completely shook to the roots by learning it. And they were, fascinated by it and wanted to know more, or they were heartbroken, like all sorts of different scenarios. And I was emailing with them and getting on the phone with people. And I was just struck by this incredible phenomenon, right? This is often people discovering things about their own origins, their own roots, the way they came into the world, their most closest, most intimate family members that are not what they thought. And when that happens to you, it is a really, really big deal, right? It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you understand and conceptualize your whole life, and it basically changes your future, right? So knowing your past can radically alter, knowing the truth about your past can radically alter everything that comes afterward. And, I just couldn't get over the idea that we were kind of like stumbling into these revelations, and that they were affecting us at our most vulnerable parts, which is, how you see yourself, which is your own personal narrative, your sense of identity. And I just thought, man, this is like a really important moment, right? This is a moment where we're like wrestling with all these questions about family and nature and nurture, what parents owe their children in terms of truth, and what children owe their parents in terms of privacy, right? All this incredible stuff, right? And I thought, we're going to look back on this. We're going to be like, this is the era when family secrets died. This was this huge moment of intergenerational reckoning. Parents had to talk differently to their children. There will know this, like, it will be bizarre that there was ever a moment that parents could keep from their own children the true, like the knowledge of their true origins. That's going to seem absurd in a few decades.
Yeah.
And this is the moment when everything changes. And I thought, holy cow. I want to capture this moment like right now for history. I want to write about all the people who are in the middle of it, all the ordinary folks who are finding themselves in these completely extraordinary circumstances. So I started compiling these stories, and I wanted to put them all into a book. And that book became The Lost Family, which came out in 2020, but it just came out in paperback this month. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Well, and I really liked how you did that with all of these smaller stories that, again, they did just kind of touch on different questions that I'd had, or the stories that I'd heard about from different people. And then you had an example of someone in this chapter, and then the science behind that and developments that are going on around that. But of course, the story, the overarching story of your book is all about Alice Collins' Playbook. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to spoil it because I did not see that coming. And it was really amazing, everything that she went through. Can you tell us, without also spoiling, why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into the home DNA testing?
Yeah. So Alice is this protagonist of the book, right? And I wanted a character whose story was as good as like a detective thriller, right? Like a suspense novel, but obviously it's true. It's nonfiction, right? But I wanted someone to carry through the book because, I wanted people to find the experience of reading about this to be as compelling as I find it to be. And at the heart of it, this genealogy craze that we're in right now, which is for sure a thing, right? Like, we're big into genealogy as Americans right now, and we've never been so big into genealogy as we are now. At its heart, it's kind of an existential quest, right? Because we are asking ourselves, who am I? Am I who I always believed myself to be? What is my essential meanness? How does the past inform that? How do revelations about the past change how I think about myself? Like, who would I have been in different circumstances, right? And so because these are all these kind of existential quests, I wanted a story that was essentially like a mystery, like an existential mystery, right? Like, where you are as invested as possible in this journey of this woman to like basically find herself through discovering the past. And I found Alice, and Alice is literally like an Agatha Christie. Like, it's totally absurd how wild her story is, and how many twists and turns and red herrings, and like what a great human being she is to just be with. So I'll just back up. She takes a DNA test in 2012. That's obviously a long time ago, in the course of in the context of DNA testing, even though it doesn't seem like a long time ago at all, right? If you're an adult, 11 years doesn't seem like that much, but in the course of DNA testing technology, it's a massive difference. And DNA testing was really just coming on the scene then. It had been around for a while, but it was just starting. It hadn't even hit mainstream consciousness, and it was still very kind of marginal in 2012 when she took the tests. So she takes a DNA test because she understands that she knows she's Irish American, Irish on both sides, grandchild of immigrants from Ireland, very strong sense of Irish Catholic identity growing up, large family. And she wants that, she knows that she's kind of hit some brick walls in her genealogical research, and she figures the DNA test is going to help her connect with cousins back in Ireland, and then she can figure out some more stuff about, her parents' family trees, especially her dad. And so she takes this test and she gets back this ethnicity estimate, which is this, when you take a DNA test, you get basically two pieces of information. You get your DNA relatives, which is people who match you because they've taken a test with the same company. So they show up as related to you in the database because you and they share overlapping genetic segments. The other thing is this ethnicity estimate, which is kind of an evolving science. It's not perfect, but it's supposed to be able to tell you where your people come from 500 to 1,000 years ago. So Alice is looking at her ethnicity estimates, and it's suggesting that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And that doesn't make any sense because, it doesn't hold true with everything else she knows about her family. So she figures, okay, Ancestry is like, they're just like not ready for prime time, right? They unveiled their test too soon. They haven't tested the science. Let me go take a test at 23andMe. They know what they're doing. So she takes a test at 23andMe, and the results come back, and yeah, she's half Ashkenazi Jewish. So then she's like, okay, like, let me try and figure out how this could be. So she's, by the way, this very methodical person. She's very into technology. She's kind of not afraid of a challenge, especially if it involves lots and lots of data. And this happens to involve a lot of data. So she starts kind of combing through her cousins, like her DNA cousins results, trying to understand how she's related, particularly to her Jewish cousins, figuring that if she can figure out the connection, then she can figure out how she got her story so wrong, which of her parents is actually Jewish, whether or not they even knew it themselves, right? And then piece together what the circumstances are. She figures at first that she's probably just not related to her dad, right? And which would be heartbreaking because he's passed away, but she adored him. She was very close to him. But she just figures, the most likely scenario is that mom stepped out on dad, had a relationship outside the marriage, right? And maybe she of the 7 Collins siblings is the only one who's actually just not related to dad. And she investigates this theory and she's able to disprove it. But that is, one of the most common types of DNA surprise. And it is a, not unusual explanation if you, expect to find yourself something and you find your half unexpected ancestry, like that's not always the explanation, but in many cases for many people, that does wind up being the explanation, but it's not for Alice. And for the next 2.5 years, she goes through every single theory that she can think of, basically in descending order of probability, because again, she's got a science mind, right? So she's just super analytical about it. She discovers that she is not, as she theorizes, an adoptee, right? She thinks maybe I'm a late discovery adoptee. Nobody told me. I'm not related to either of my parents. Nope. She's able to disprove that. She thinks, well, maybe I'm donor conceived. And it wasn't a relationship outside the marriage, but it was a donor conception that she can disprove. She figures, okay, maybe my people were Irish Jews. They kind of converted their way out of their their religion, or they assimilated their way out of it to escape from discrimination. Nope, she can disprove that. And finally, she finally decides that the explanation has to be this completely wild, far-fetched theory that nobody thinks is possible, and that's the one she winds up proving. And it's completely amazing, and it winds up being, a 100-year-old mystery. And so one of the pleasures of writing the book was that I got to go back and do all this historical research that went back a century into the circumstances of how the DNA mystery came to be. It's completely wild. But what I love about Alice's story, I mean, it's she's relatable because she's just an awesome human being. The situation is not one that many of us will face because her circumstances are so unusual, but it allows me to tell many other stories. Because when I am looking at the possibility that she's not related to her dad, I get to explore the phenomenon of non-paternity events or not parent expected, misattributed parentage as a result of DNA testing. That's a huge phenomenon affecting hundreds of thousands of people, if not more. And on and on. I get to talk about late discovery adoptees, people discovering their donor conceived, people discovering they have many, many donor siblings, like all those kind of scenarios. And along the way, all of these people, and really all of us, whether or not you've taken a DNA test, are all kind of grappling with these questions about identity and DNA and nature and nurture and who am I at the core of myself? These are kind of age-old essential human questions that I think the DNA age just dramatizes and makes more personal for lots of people. And so that piece of it, telling Alice's story, in addition to kind of being a good mystery, is a way of getting into these kind of issues that many of us are grappling with now.
Well, and it's interesting too, all of the NPEs events that happen. The fact that it is a Christmas gift that people do, and then surprise, this wasn't what you were expecting for Christmas this year. You're not really related to the people you thought you were.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, I get it because the curiosity is there, and there's this thing. I have it too, where you hear the stories about generations back. You're this far removed from Germany and Norway and Ireland, and my grandma can tell me percentages of what I would be on her side, at least. And so you wonder how much of that makes me.
Yeah.
And so that curiosity is there. But the one story that struck me was the sperm donor whose kids all started coming out of the woodwork, and he has family reunions for them all now. They're all friends. That is awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, men react very differently to the revelation that they have children, right? That they didn't know about. Whether those children come about because they, like one guy that I interviewed had a relationship when he was 16. He literally, it had been so many years, it had been over 30 years. He didn't actually remember consummating this relationship, but he clearly had, right? Because his daughter was born. He didn't even know that his girlfriend got pregnant. And then, 32 years passed by and she finds him on Ancestry because they're matching his parent child. And he's like, this is an amazing blessing, right? And then some men are, totally freaked out by it. They may feel very guilty or ashamed. This may clash with their sense of their own characters, or it may threaten them, or it may feel like threatening to their family that this revelation that they have a child that they didn't know about. And they they just kind of put their hands up. This guy, Robert, that you're talking about, I was really interested in telling the story of like a large donor family, right? Because I think, those situations raise questions about like, do we even have the right language? Like, is this family? What do we call this? Because there's a certain amount of choice involved when you're meeting a sibling that you didn't grow up with, right? You can choose to have a relationship with that person. You can choose not to have a relationship with that person. And, there's the competing lures of biology, right? On the one hand, you might be drawn to them. And on the other hand, an entire life experience without having that sibling in your life. So it changes your life radically, but, the ways that people interpret it and how it changes can really vary. And Robert had donated in the 1970s. He was a sperm donor in the 70s. Everyone calls it, by the way, donation. It's not really donation. He was paid $25 every time he, made a deposit. And he did this for a long time. And, he was married. He had a child. His wife was like, here's a way to make ends meet. And literally it was like the amount of money they needed per month, that $25 was like covering some expenses. It was just like helping them meet the gap. So I think he did this for like 2 years. And he then years later took this DNA test without even knowing it was a means of finding relatives. He thought he was just getting that ethnicity estimate, that little pie chart that tells you how Italian you are. He didn't even know what he was getting into. And then all his donor children start basically like, knocking on his door, right? And saying hi. And did you test because you wanted to meet us? Because we really want to meet you. Some of them really did. And for him, it was this delicate dance of not knowing how to react, feeling quite cautious, wanting to give them what they wanted, but at the same time, like not sure. He didn't want to change his life radically. He wasn't sure what he owed to them. He wasn't sure. He didn't want to overstep because many of them already had dads. Some of them had not been told they were donor conceived. And so they were like grieving for that. But what finally happened was that he and his family, so he and his wife and his daughters that he raised, they came to a kind of ease with some of his donor children, where they would spend Thanksgiving and have camping trips with them, and they started to form relationships. And it's an amazing story. I tell it from the point of view of Robert, but also one of his donor children named Stephanie, and that dance of even just like what to call each other, right, and how to behave, because they are intimately genetically connected, but they're strangers. They know nothing of each other, and forming a relationship in those circumstances is super challenging.
Well, and it's heartbreaking too when you think about the adoptees that they've already been given up once,
Mm-hmm.
and then they go to look for their birth parents and run that risk of being denied again, of being rejected again, and that's rough. Those stories were really hard, and I respect the people who actually go out on a limb to do that and risk that hurt.
Yeah,
I mean, stories were really touching.
There's just so many reasons why, if you've been cut off from your biological roots, why you may want to know what your roots are and potentially have relationships with, your birth parents or your siblings. And it's, it's not just down to medical information, although that's very important. There's all these questions about the context for your life and identity and roots, and you can't answer those questions without it, right? But you're absolutely right. Then there's a vulnerability there too. So, I tell the story of a woman named Jackie who, she's a foundling. So she was placed in a basket, and she was placed on a pastor's doorstep in 1962, I think was the year. She was 4 days old. And she was, the pastor, took her in. She was adopted by a family. And she grew up knowing that she had been adopted, and also wanting to know the circumstances of how she'd come into the world very, very much wanting to know her birth mother, very, very much wanting to understand kind of the landscape of how she'd been placed on that doorstep, right? She wanted to understand, she needed that context. She needed that. And in adulthood, she did eventually, through DNA testing, manage to find her siblings. She has multiple sisters, on both paternal half-sisters and maternal half-sisters. And the heartbreaking thing is, her birth parents are no longer alive, but the heartbreaking thing is that nobody wanted a relationship with her through no fault of her own. And unfortunately, when you have been made into a secret, and your very existence is something people don't know about, sometimes your existence is threatening. And it is so unfair, but it is true that sometimes people who have, come into the world in a way that they could not control are made to bear the burden of that, right? So her paternal half-sisters are basically like, our dad was not the most awesome guy in the world. And like, this is kind of reminding us, like having a relationship with you and getting to know you is kind of reminding us of him. And we're just not ready for that right now. So no, thank you. And so that was like a big blow. And then her maternal half-sisters said, we don't believe you. We don't believe you, even though, relative matches are quite reliable. They were matching her in the database. But they said, we just don't trust this. We don't believe these results, because our mother wouldn't do that. Our mother would not do that. And this is where, the facts of sort of like science as revealed by DNA test can butt up against the sacred narratives that we have about, say, our parents, right? What would our parents do? What were they capable of? Who were they? How much did they love us, right? It's so threatening, right? If your parents didn't tell you something in real life when they were alive, to discover it later through this discovery of a half sister. And some people just basically shut down and they can't handle it. And it's, I'm not saying that's all the stories, right? There's some beautiful, incredible reunion stories, amazing. But we have to talk about the other ones too, because that is the reality of what's going on. And people really need help and they need to feel normalized. They need to know that they're not alone, right? And there's nothing obviously essentially wrong with them. It's the circumstances that they can't control when they're reaching out, the circumstances of having not been known before, that makes it so difficult for them to be then accepted in adulthood.
And another thing about the research that I wasn't thinking about it in these terms, but the African American population in this country that's also trying to find roots, and then they hit those brick walls because of the lack of records due to
Right.
slavery. And then, I mean, my goodness, yeah, what
Right.
I'm sure that there's more research you've done on that since the book, even probably.
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about populations that have been essentially like disenfranchised or disempowered by the lack of records, and just to pull back to adopted people often don't have access to their original birth certificates. They can't find the names of their birth parents, right? Donor conceived people often don't know the names of they usually don't know their sperm donors, because those men were often promised anonymity. And for vastly different historical reasons, African Americans, we're not, genealogy is really, really hard when your people were, lower down on the hierarchy, because kind of the lower you are in terms of social station, the less worthy you are considered of being written, like the less worthy you are of being written about according to history, right? Being recorded, you have to be literate to be able to keep your own records, right? You have to have been considered important enough to be written about. You have to, your records need to have been preserved. All of these things come into play when you're trying to research your forebears. So for African Americans who are trying to, say, for instance, trace their ancestors through the federal census, they will slam into a brick wall if they try to go back before 1870, because before 1870, people who were enslaved were not named. So you followed your great-great-grandmother and all of a sudden she disappears, right? There's all these other challenges having to do with families being separated. It's really, really hard to do that kind of research. DNA testing can help people get around that, because then you're connecting up with modern day cousins. You're hooking into their family trees, right? And you're able to kind of piece together more information. The ethnicity estimates may also help you. So I tell the stories in the book of a couple of African American genealogists who are able to, in one case, basically confirm an oral history in a family that this family believed, they had always understood that they were descended from an enslaved woman who had had a child by a white enslaver, and that was the family lore. But they didn't know if that story was completely true. Through DNA, they were able to confirm it, and then they were able to actually connect with a white cousin, so a cousin who was a child of the enslaver's line with his white wife, and that cousin didn't kind of see it coming because that cousin didn't know, right? But this is the reality for a lot of white Americans with roots in the South, going back to that era, is that this is what happened, right? And we may not even know that our ancestors owned human beings, but that's part of the work actually that we have to do. And in that way, I kind of see DNA testing as like forcing us to look at the realities of history, which is, I think, very important. And then I tell a story also in the book of an African American genealogist who's able to trace his way back to where his forebears came before the transatlantic slave trade. In other words, he gets to figure out exactly where they came from, not just like Africa or West Africa or a specific country, but he finds modern day African cousins. So people never left Africa who tested at 23andMe. And when he connects up with them and he's able to figure out which branch and how he's related to them, he actually also communicates with one of them. And this cousin says, "Oh yeah, our people are the Fulani." Well, that's amazing, right? That's not a country or a region or a specific area of a country. That is a community. And that knowledge, that granular knowledge, this genealogist would never have had access to if not for DNA. So that's like literally the gift of the past coming into his lap, because of this. And it would not be possible through the records. It would just absolutely not be possible.
And then you also touch on the issues of privacy and when does it cross the line? When are we going to get because again, this was one of the parts I was waiting to come up in your book, was about the Golden State Killer, because I love true crime.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really cool that they caught him with DNA, and all the cold cases that are now being solved.
Hundreds of them.
Those people deserve justice. At the same time, you're like, ooh.
Right. Like if I took a test, did I consent to that? Right. It's complicated. There's this question of, if you took a DNA test because you wanted to unravel your family history, and then without you knowing it or without you consenting, your DNA is used to catch, I don't know, some third cousin who was a homicidal maniac in the 70s, right? Is that okay? Well, it might be okay. A lot of people are kind of cool with that. And at the same time, there are all these other questions about how is this being used? Is this only being used for the most egregious crimes? Who's putting up guardrails and guidelines for this? At the moment, there's no regulation that exists to say, well, we're going to use this just for sexual assaults and homicides, but not for, I don't know, much, much lesser crimes. And it has been used in some cases on different kinds and lesser kinds of crimes. So is that a problem, right? Should we have some sort of overarching, if you look back on the history of DNA and law enforcement investigations, there is a kind of a system called CODIS, which is where offender DNA goes in to the system and gets analyzed and then can produce hits when police officers and detectives are looking for, to see if they can match crime scene DNA to a known offender kind of thing. It's not as richly informative as the kind of DNA that's being analyzed for the purposes of family history, which is just a treasure trove. So a lot of things, even when they put that information into CODIS and do a search, which they don't always do, may not produce a hit, but you can produce a hit with using family history research, DNA type DNA, and that's because that DNA is so informative that you can identify people who aren't in the database by what's called long-range familial searching. And that is something you should know about, not just because it's part of cold case investigations, but because it also means that that if you are a man who had a child in the 70s and didn't know it, or maybe didn't have a relationship with that child, and you never took a DNA test, you can still be identified by that child if they're looking for you through people that have tested, say third or second cousins, right? Those people who've tested are going to match that child, and that child's going to be able to unravel your identity. So that means that all of us need to think about these questions of privacy, because even if you haven't tested, you're potentially affected by the revelations around family or health history. All those kinds of things can come out even when you've never taken a test. That's pretty amazing. And so just to get back to the cold cases, which this new field is known as investigative genetic genealogy, there are a lot of unanswered questions about when this is warranted, when this should be allowed. Databases perform differently in terms of what they permit. So the big companies like Ancestry and 23andMe have basically said, we're not letting any investigations of this sort happen on our watch. If you, Mr. Law Enforcement or Ms. Law Enforcement, come to us with a subpoena or a warrant, we will fight it. And other companies like Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch have kind of jumped into it with both feet and said, sure, and if you've tested at one of those places, GEDmatch is a third-party site. So if you have uploaded there, you need to pay attention to the rules, because you may be able to opt out, but you have to know enough to know that you're opting out if this is something that you're not comfortable with. And there are all these other kind of privacy issues that have emerged about, whether this information can become accessible in other ways. It's a real minefield that we have to be paying attention to now that there are about 40 million people who have taken a DNA test.
And not just as far as crime goes, but also the concern of insurance companies being able to deny someone coverage because of a genetic marker. I remember that being a real concern a while ago. I'm sure people still do worry about that to some degree.
Still a concern. Yeah. I haven't seen cases where it's happened. I interviewed a bioethicist who told me like, oh, it's just a matter of time. It's going to happen, right? That's the question. I mean, how would the insurance company get a hold of that information to discriminate against you if they wanted to? And by the way, there are some federal protections against certain kinds of insurance discrimination, but it's not comprehensive. So certain things, life insurance, disability, long-term care, these are not protected in most places. You're not protected against insurance discrimination. So, how could this happen? How could a company, like a life insurance company, get a hold of this information? Potentially, they could ask you to declare it, and they could send you when you're signing up. They might say, "That's interesting that you want that. You seem like a healthy person. I'm wondering if you took a DNA test that alerted you to the fact that you are going to be at higher than average risk of a particular debilitating disease. We don't want to kind of, get in the business of just insuring people who we know are going to be becoming very sick, because then we're going to lose a lot of money. So like, have you taken a DNA test that, gave you information about your health your health risks? And you might kind of be prompted to declare it. And if you declare it, they might turn you down. And if you don't, then if they ever discovered that you did, which again, I don't know how that would happen, but this is the theoretical possibility, then they could consider that fraud, or the contract could be considered void. So these are all things we have to be thinking about, like moving forward, especially as like, beyond the family history research world, the world of DNA testing for family history research with companies like Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA. There's also 23andMe, which gives a lot of health information if you want to take a test for that. And then there's a whole other world of semi-direct consumer testing for things like cancers, and things like that, where it's not exactly the same as an ancestry test, because you're getting some information about your health and that's it. You're not getting that finding on how Italian you are, but that's a whole other world that's emerging that people are able to find out information about risk on. And that as more people get that information, this is going to become more of an issue probably for insurance industries.
So how did all of the DNA testing for genealogy purposes, how did that even start? I know that you talked about it in your book, but it was a while ago. That was at the beginning. Yeah, that's a good question. So the industry started 21 years ago in the US. It started with a man named Bennett Greenspan, who lives down in Houston, Texas. And he was and is a genealogist, and he was and is an entrepreneur with like a canny kind of business sense for for when there needed to be an industry that didn't exist yet, basically. And so he kind of was in between companies. He was kind of early retired. I think he was like in his 40s, and it was the late 90s. And he had a genealogy quandary. He had hit a brick wall. He couldn't seem to answer this question of whether this like maybe possible distant relative was actually genetically a distant relative. The guy lived in Argentina, Greenspan's in Texas. They're writing back and forth. They're sending documents. They can't confirm the relationship. They can't figure out if they're actually related. And Greenspan has this epiphany that DNA testing, which is something that he's been reading like science papers about, right? Population genetics, research into human populations. He has this epiphany that maybe one of these tests, if he could just get his hands on one of them, right, might be able to tell him if this possible relative is an actual relative. And so he
being not at all a shy guy, being a very talkative and charismatic guy, actually looks up the phone number for this scientist whose name he has seen on the top of one of these papers. And he calls the guy at home on a weekend. And the guy's wife puts the scientist on the phone, and Bennett says, "Hey, how are you doing? I'd like to buy a DNA kit from you." And the guy's like, "That's not a thing, right? Like, we use this in the context of the lab. Like, I'm not in the business of selling these DNA tests." And according to the way Bennett Greenspan tells the story, this is when he has his second epiphany, which is that this is a potential business waiting, right? If there are people like him, crazy genealogists, who are so obsessed with answering these questions that they're willing to buy one of these pretty expensive, as it turns out back then, DNA test kits, if he exists, maybe there's somebody else like him out there and he can make a business out of it. And he winds up going into business with this scientist, and they launched this company called Family Tree DNA. And that is the very beginning, but it is so obscure in the beginning. It is so expensive. It is a different kind of DNA test than is available now. It's not as informative. It's hundreds of dollars. So nobody's really doing it. I mean, some people are doing it, hardcore family history enthusiasts, but it's not a mainstream consumer item. And for 10 years, it's not a mainstream consumer item. And then they figure out how that they can offer testing for something called autosomal DNA. The industry figures that out. And autosomal DNA is DNA that you inherit from both your parents. And so that DNA can tell you your relatives on your maternal and your paternal side, right? And give you that ethnicity estimate. And that's a game changer. And you see Ancestry get in the market. Ancestry puts so much money into advertising. They have these really iconic ads where there's like this guy in Lederhosen, and he says he thought that he was German, and he turned out to be Scottish. And he says, "And I traded in my Lederhosen for a kilt." And you see him like all of a sudden in this kilt. And there's so many ads like that Ancestry has kind of tapped into this rootless American desire to know who we truly are, right? Which is a bit maybe simplistic in and of itself, this idea that your ethnicity is something that's in the genes rather than your own experience, right? Because of course it's not, right? It's often shaped by our communities and our lived experience. It's not really rooted in genes. Ethnicity is not that. It's a little bit, can be a little bit troubling and a little bit genetically essentialist to kind of make those assumptions, but the ads are very, very appealing. And you start seeing this shift where it's not just, family history enthusiasts, the most intense genealogists who are taking these tests. It becomes a Christmas gift. It becomes a Father's Day gift. It becomes the gift you get for the person in your life who already has everything, right? And it becomes so cheap. And that is why, that is part of why, in addition to just the number of people who are doing it, there's a kind of a disconnect between people's expectations going in and how big a deal they feel that they're making, how much of an investment they feel that they're making, which is very little, and the profundity of what they get back, right? So there's a kind of a mismatch between what I've put in and what I'm getting out. Sometimes you put in, $59 if it's on sale, and you get back results that are very boring. And you say, "This is all what I expected. This DNA testing thing is boring. I'm never going to look at my results again." But there's a significant subset of people who take a test expecting everything to be in line with what they thought and finding it's radically different than they thought. And that is a huge emotional big deal. It is changing the rest of their lives. It's often a trauma. And that's the kind of fascinating moment we find ourselves in, which is also in many ways a kind of a mental health issue, because a lot of people are, deeply, deeply traumatized by these revelations, and there's nobody there to really hold their hand.
And then that's another kind of emerging business, psychological, is trying to help those people.
Yeah, exactly.
And I had never heard of search angels before either. And I didn't even know that the place in Salt Lake City existed. That if you guys haven't read the book, you other participants tonight, you need to read the book because it is chock full of really interesting stuff. I couldn't put it down, honestly. I'm
Thank
not
you.
huge into genealogy. Like I say, my grandma on both sides, they could tell me anything I wanted to know. And they had all their little stories about their parents and their grandparents and their great grandparents. I mean, that was about as far back as it went. And then the funny stories, I think one of my aunties found out that our family got kicked out of Canada at some point, but
What did they do to deserve that? Oh my gosh.
war profiteering, I don't know.
Wow.
But, it's just kind of funny stuff that,
Yeah.
but after reading this book, I get it. I get the fervor that some people
Yeah.
have in the genealogy craze. It's
completely
just
an
like a
obsession.
puzzle.
Yeah, it's completely an obsession. And I fell down that rabbit hole as I was writing the book, actually, because I did go out to the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is the biggest genealogical library in the world. It's like a mecca. It's so amazing. And there's all these volunteers waiting to help you. It's free. Like, it's crazy. It's crazy. And you start to see how, like, you get a little bite at the apple, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, what else can I find? Can I figure out my great grandparents' names? Is that possible? Oh my God, I'm digging. And then you lose track of time and it's dark outside. Like, and there's so many people I interviewed who would describe this to me, genealogists going back many, many decades, like a woman who was a genealogist back in, I think in the 70s and up till now, was telling me about how, like, she does these research projects, and especially now with all this information online, you just kind of go, she called it seeing a squirrel. She said, like, I would be doing a project with some research buddies, and then all of a sudden something would happen and we would get distracted and we start digging and digging and digging. We'd look up and it would be 3 a.m. and one of us would say, like, what happened to you? And you would say, like, oh, I saw a squirrel. There's a lot of squirrels in family history, right? And it is just so compelling because there's just so many things available online, so many cousins to connect with, so many surnames and hometowns to compare, so many trees to examine. You can do it forever. You can just keep going back.
So before we open up questions to everybody else, and you can put questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves if you have questions for Libby.
And you can put them in now if you want. Like,
yeah,
feel free to start
absolutely.
typing it out. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people who are thinking about doing a home DNA test?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I used to, I used to sort of say, it's important to think about, when you take a DNA test, there's an advisory. Depending on the company, the wording is a bit different, but the general advisory you get is that you may discover unexpected relatives, or you may discover things that change your worldview. And most people don't pay attention to that because we assume we know all there is to know, right? We think, well, that happens to other people, but that's not going to happen to me because I would have a sixth sense. I would know. And maybe later on, looking back, you might, right? You might say, I guess I kind of did wonder about a feeling of otherness or a thing my mom said when I was a kid. But going in, maybe it's a self-protective mechanism. Maybe it's just too crazy making for us to consider our lives in this way. But very, very few people, unless they're actually setting out to answer a question or a lingering mystery, very, very few people go, oh, well, maybe I'm about to find something that's going to completely upend my identity, make me question my parents, and, radically alter my life, right? That's just not how we kind of operate. So I started to feel like maybe telling people to kind of think carefully wasn't the right approach. And also, the vast majority of people I found who discovered something, about their genetic origins was different than they thought. They suffered, they said it was painful, but they almost always said they were glad to know because it changed their lives, because it changed the context for everything. It answered questions, right? It was so important to know the truth at last. So I started thinking maybe the advice is not for people in advance of taking a DNA test. Maybe the advice is for the older generation who, for very, very understandable reasons within a vastly different cultural context, kept secrets or didn't tell their children the full truth about the circumstances of how they came into the world. about their actual, say, genetic parents, because of stigmas and taboos and all these things, right? Um, it's totally understandable that those secrets, those decisions were made, and it's also understandable that often that they were kept. But now we're operating in a different cultural context where a lot of those stigmas have fallen away, and people are going to find out the truth about their genetic origins. It's just a matter of time, right? So if you're the parent who didn't tell your child, it might be the time to get in front of that and tell that child, because it's going to come a lot better from you than it is from a DNA test, because you can answer questions, you can explain, you can, kind of put some meat on the bones of that story. The adult child can then ask you questions. It's an important process to go through. And God forbid you pass away and your child is making this discovery after you've passed and they can't ask those questions. That is a heartbreak. And I've talked to a lot of people in that position. And to never be able to have those questions answered, man, that is really, really hard. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from, is this idea that maybe this moment of intergenerational reckoning, in some cases it's kind of forced, right? Honest, because people are taking a DNA test and they're making this discovery. Maybe this is an opportunity for some families to then start talking about these difficult truths.
And Mary Beth asked if you took a DNA test yourself.
Yeah, I've taken 3 actually. And you might say, like, why take more than one, right? Your DNA doesn't change. Yes, your DNA doesn't change, but the company's ability to tell you information about it does vary. And that's because, depending on where you test, you're going to match to different relatives, because you're only matching to people who've tested at the same company. So if you're looking for a second cousin who's going to, potentially help you understand a particular branch of the family, and they only tested at one of those companies, you're not going to find them if you tested at the other one. So one reason to take a test is that. And another is the ethnicity estimates. I mentioned that those are really more of a rough estimate. They're not perfect. I was very curious to compare, the ethnicity estimates and how they varied and how they evolved and got better over time. And we did discover amazing stuff, on both my sides of my family. My mom and my dad both found second cousins who were related to them through connections like in the old country. So, and they were people we would not have known to look for and would not have found without DNA. So on my mother's side, one of her grandparents left Ukraine, and never spoke of the many siblings that he had left behind. And so we just assumed that we had no idea what happened. We didn't necessarily assume they survived, because they were Jews in Ukraine in the 20th century. And there were a lot of really bad things that happened, right? And then through DNA testing, we found that my mom had a second cousin whose family had stayed in Ukraine. He had been raised there, and he had eventually left and moved to Israel and then come to Brooklyn. And we're in New York, by the way, north of the city. So we were like on the phone with him, and our like minds were being blown that my mom was in conversation with her second cousin, right? And this was this connection to these siblings several generations up. It was crazy. And then on my mom's side, we found a second cousin to my dad in Sweden, and we actually went to Sweden and met her. And again, wouldn't have happened without DNA. It was crazy. We were able to see, like, my dad's grandmother had come to Sweden she'd come from Sweden to the US in the 1890s as a teenager. We were able to go back and visit where she'd lived, where she'd worshiped, and the school that she attended. All of that was still there. And it was just mind blowing. And I mean, her life has informed mine, even though I never met her. So I think, the through line between my experience and, the people I've written about is this sense of the immediacy of the past. The past isn't over. We think of it as very, very over. We think of ourselves as thoroughly modern human beings. But of course, we are made of the bits and pieces of the people who came this way, and the bits and pieces of accidents and whims and, little historical, things that happened all of a sudden that nobody expected or even planned, right? All of these things make up who we are. We owe ourselves to that. And so the ability to take a DNA test and find out all this incredible stuff about the past and how it lives on in you, I just think that's completely amazing that we're living in this moment.
Well, Mary Beth says she can't wait to read the book. She thinks it's very fascinating. And I have a question that I don't want to forget to ask. What's your next project?
That I don't know. I have some ideas, but but they're not ready for prime time yet, unfortunately.
Do you think you'll revisit this subject ever?
Um, Maybe in some form. Like I'm very, very interested in family and this idea of these questions around um, what informs our identities. I mean, that's a lifelong interest. So I feel like I may kind of come back to it in some fashion. Yeah.
Did anybody else have any questions that they'd want to put in the chat, or you can unmute and ask with your very own voices?
And as we're waiting to see if there's any other questions, I'll mention that I have a newsletter, which I'm going to put in the chat. If you want to sign up, it's free. Like it's like once a month, if not less. And it's at my website, which is libbycopeland.com. And I write about DNA, genealogy, and all this kind of stuff. And then I'm also going to throw in the chat, there's my book is available in various places, but if you want a signed copy, I work with a bookstore near my house in New York called the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. And you can get a signed copy and they'll ship it anywhere in the country. So I'm going to put that in the chat if you want a signed copy, because it's kind of like this. It's kind of like a nice book tour perk that we have not been able to do because of virtual events, but I'm looking for that right now. Hang on. Here it is.
I think that one of the things that I enjoyed most about the book was it was very approachable, even though it's pretty heavy science. I never felt overwhelmed by
I'm so glad.
that science. It was really those anecdotes, the stories were very personal and approachable and relatable, even though, I don't have really much in common with the stories that you told. You did a really, really good job of making all of them very approachable. I so enjoyed the book. I really did.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is a science book written by an avowed non-scientist, right? Like I am not a scientist. So I would get on the phone with these scientists and they would tell me something. I'd be like, can you say that again? And then they'd explain it. And I'd say, so let me just repeat this back and tell me if I understand right. Like, and we would go on this way, till I really understood it. Because again, I don't have a background in biology. I had the whole thing vetted by a geneticist. Like I had it read over by multiple scientists to make sure like that I was explaining it right. But I wanted it to be, we are doing this, right? We're spitting into vials.
Mhm.
We're tens of millions of us are doing this already. We should know what's happening when our DNA goes into the lab. We should like understand the process. We should understand what our DNA is. It's fascinating once you have it explained to you. And I think the more accessible that information is, like the more empowered and informed we are. Yeah.
Well, if no one else has any questions, I've gotten the answers to all my questions. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I'm so happy that Holly reached out to us and said you were available. So
Thank you so much. And thank you for the folks who joined. I really appreciate it. It was really fun. So
publish another one, we'll have you back.
Okay, awesome. Will do. Just give me a little while, at least a month.
We'll take your time.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Again, this will be available on the St. Joseph Public Library's YouTube channel. Libby has granted us permission to have it up there indefinitely. So refer all your friends and relatives to watch it before they spit in the vial.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was so fun. Okay. Bye, Jen.
Bye.